Okay, we're continuing on page 236. I'm going to reread that paragraph again that we stopped on because I'm going to be going right through from that point on again. So the middle of page 236, first column. Having pondered this, I am of the opinion, Nichiren is saying, though the Lotus Sutra teaches that persons of the two vehicles can attain Buddhahood, this view tends to be overshadowed by the opposite view propounded in the sutras that precede the Lotus Sutra. How much more so is this the case with the doctrine that the Buddha attained enlightenment in the remote past? For in this case, it is not the Lotus Sutra as a whole that stands in contradiction to the earlier sutras, but the essential teaching of the Lotus Sutra that stands in contradiction both to the earlier sutras and to the first 14 chapters of the theoretical teaching of the Lotus Sutra. Moreover, of the latter 14 chapters of the essential teaching, all of them with the exception of the emerging from the earth and lifespan chapters retain the view that the Buddha first attained enlightenment in his present lifetime. Continue where we left off. First column, page 236, last paragraph. The 40 volumes of the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, preached by the Buddha in the grove of sal trees just before his passing, as well as the other Mahayana sutras except the Lotus Sutra, have not one single word to say about the fact that the Buddha attained enlightenment in the remote past. They speak of the Dharma body of the Buddha as being without beginning and without end, that they do not reveal the true nature of the other two bodies, the reward body and the manifested body. How then can we expect people to cast aside the vast body of writings represented by the earlier Mahayana Sutras, the Nirvana Sutra, and the major portion of theoretical and essential teachings of the Lotus Sutra, and put all their faith simply in the two chapters, emerging from the earth and lifespan? If we examine the origins of the school called Dharma Characteristics, we find that 900 years after the Buddha passed away in India, there was a great scholar called Bodhisattva Asanga. At night, he ascended to the inner court of the Tushita heaven, where he came before Bodhisattva Maitreya and resolved his doubts concerning the sacred teachings propounded by the Buddha during his lifetime. In the daytime, he worked to propagate the Dharma Characteristics doctrines in the state of Avodhava. Among his disciples were various great scholars such as Vasubandhu, Dharmapala, Nanda, and Shilabhadra. The great ruler, King Shiladitya, bowed his head in reverence, and the people of all the 5 regions of India abandoned their arrogance and declared themselves followers of his teachings. The Tripitaka master Sun Tang of China journeyed to India, spending 17 years visiting 130 or more Indian states. He rejected all the other teachings of Buddhism, but brought back the doctrines of the Dharma Characteristics school to China and presented them to the worthy sovereign, Emperor Tai Tsung. Xuanzang numbered among his disciples such men, but to the worthy sovereign Emperor Tai Tsung. Xuanzang numbered among his disciples such men as Xingfang, Chiashan, Pu Kuang, and Kuye Chi. He preached his teachings in Tzu Temple and spread them through more than 360 districts of China. In the reign of Emperor Kotoku, the 37th sovereign of Japan, Doji, Dosho, and other priests went to China and studied these doctrines, and on their return preached them at Yamashina Dera Temple. In this way, the Dharma Characteristics School was regarded as the leading school of Buddhism throughout all 3 lands of India, China, and Japan. According to this school and all the teachings of the Buddha, from the Flower Garland Sutra, the earliest of the sutras, to the Lotus and Nirvana Sutras, which were preached last, it is laid down that those sentient beings without the nature of enlightenment and those predestined for the 2 vehicles can never become Buddhas. The Buddha, they say, never contradicts himself. Therefore, if he once declared that these people will never be able to attain Buddhahood, then even should the sun and moon fall to the earth or the great earth itself turn upside down, that declaration can never be altered. In the earlier sutras, those sentient beings without the nature of enlightenment and those predestined for the 2 vehicles were said to be incapable of attaining Buddhahood. Therefore, they conclude, even in the Lotus or Nirvana Sutra, it is never said that they can, in fact, do so. Close your eyes and consider the matter, the members of the Dharma characteristic school would say, if it had in fact been plainly stated in the Lotus and Nirvana Sutras that those who possess no innate nature of enlightenment or those predestined for the two vehicles can actually attain Buddhahood, then why would the great scholars such as Asanga and Vasubandhu or the Tripitaka masters and teachers such as Zhuangzong and Tsuin not have taken notice of this fact? Why did they not mention it in their own writings? Why did they not accept the belief and transmit it to later ages? Why did Asanga not question Bodhisattva Maitreya about it? People like you, Nichiren, claim that you are basing your assertions on the text of the Lotus Sutra, but in fact you are simply accepting the biased views of men like Tentai, Myolo, and Dingyo and interpreting the text of the sutra in light of their teachings. Therefore you claim that the Lotus Sutra is as different from the earlier sutras as fire from water. Again, there are Flower Garland and True Word schools which are of an incomparably higher level than the Dharma characteristics and three treatises schools. They claim that the doctrines that persons of the two vehicles may attain Buddhahood and that the Buddha achieved enlightenment in the remote past are to be found not only in the Lotus Sutra, but in the Flower Garland and Mahavrachana Sutras as well. According to these schools, the Flower Garland patriarchs Tu Xun, Qi Yin, Fa Zhang, and Qing Quan, and the True Word Masters Shamu Wei, Qing Kan Xie, and Pukung were far more eminent than Tentai or Dengyo. Moreover, they claim that Shamu Wei's teachings descend in an unbroken line from the thus come one Mahavrachana. How could men like this, who are manifestations of the Buddha, possibly be mistaken, they ask. They point to the passage in the Flower Garland Sutra that reads, some people perceive that immeasurable numbers of kalpas have passed since Shakyamuni attained the Buddha way. Or a passage in the Mahavrachana Sutra that says, I, Mahavrachana Buddha, am the source, the beginnings of all, and the beginning of all things. Why, they ask, would anyone claim that it is the lifespan chapter of the Lotus Sutra alone that expounds the doctrine that Shakyamuni attained enlightenment long ago? Persons who do so are like frogs in the bottom of a well that have never seen the great sea, or are like mountain dwellers who know nothing of the capital. You people, you, Nichiren, you people look only at the lifespan chapter and know nothing of the Flower Garland, the Mahavrachana, and the other sutras. Do you suppose that in India and China and in Silla, Korea, and Pakchek in Korea, people believe that these two doctrines are limited to the Lotus Sutra alone? As we have seen, the Lotus Sutra, which was preached over a period of 8 years, is quite different from the earlier sutras preached over a period of some 40 years. If one had to choose between the two, one ought to, by rights, to choose the Lotus Sutra that was preached later, and yet the earlier sutras in many ways appear to carry greater weight. While the Buddha was still alive, there would have been good reasons for choosing the Lotus Sutra, but in the ages since his passing, the teachers and scholars have in most cases shown a preference for the earlier sutras. Not only is the Lotus Sutra itself difficult to believe, but in addition, with the coming of the latter age, sages and worthies gradually disappear from the scene, and deluded people increase in number. People are prone to make mistakes even in shallow worldly affairs. So how much more likely are they to be mistaken about the profound Buddhist teachings that lead to enlightenment? Last full paragraph, first column, page 238. Vasu and Vaipulya were keen and perceptive, but still they confused the Hinayana and Mahayana sutras. Vilamitra and Madhava were very clever by nature, but they could not distinguish properly between the provisional teachings and the true teaching. These men lived during the 1,000-year period known as the former day of the law, not far removed in time from the Buddha himself, and in the same country of India, and yet they fell into error as we have seen. And much more likely, therefore, how much more likely, therefore, that the people of China and India should do so, since these countries are far removed from India and speak different languages from it. Now human beings have grown increasingly dull by nature. Their lifespan diminishes steadily, and the three poisons of greed, anger, and foolishness continue to multiply. Many ages have passed since the Buddha's demise, and the Buddhist scriptures are all misunderstood. Who these days has the wisdom to interpret them correctly? Therefore, the Buddha predicted in the Nirvana Sutra that in the latter day of the law, those who abide by the correct teaching will be as few as the specks of dirt that can be placed on a fingernail, while those who slander the correct teaching will be as numerous as the specks of dirt in all the lands of the 10 directions. In the Decline of the Law Sutra, we find a passage stating that those who slander the correct teaching will be as numerous as the sands of the Ganges, but those who abide by the correct teaching will be no more than 1 or 2 pebbles. Though 500 or 1,000 years go by, it will be difficult to find even a single person who believes in the correct teaching. Those who fall into the evil paths because of secular crimes will be as insignificant in number as the specks of dirt placed on a fingernail. But those who do so because of violations of the Buddhist teachings will be equal in number to the specks of dirt in all the lands of the 10 directions. More monks than laymen and more nuns than lay women will fall into the evil paths. Here Nichiren considers as follows, so he is again injecting, this is my perception. Here Nichiren considers as follows, last paragraph, second column, page 238. Already over 200 years have passed since the world entered the latter day of the law, since the 500-year period has begun, okay? I was born in a remote land, and moreover, I am a person of low station and a priest of humble learning. While being born again and again amid the 6 paths, I have perhaps at times been born as a great ruler in the human or heavenly world, and have bent the multitudes to my will, as a great wind bends the branches of small trees, at the top of page 239. And yet, at times, I was not able to become a Buddha. And yet, at such times, I was not able to become a Buddha. I may have become all of the other things that you could accomplish in life, but I was still never able to attain enlightenment. I see, so he continues, I studied the Hinayana and Mahayana Sutras, beginning as an ordinary practitioner with no understanding at all, and gradually moving upward to the position of great bodhisattva. For 1 kalpa, 2 kalpas, countless kalpas, I devoted myself to the practices of the bodhisattva until I almost reached the stage of non-regression. And yet, I was dragged down by the powerful and overwhelming influences of evil, and I never attained Buddhahood. I do not know whether I was among the 3rd group who failed to take faith when the sons of the great universal wisdom excellence Buddha preached the Lotus Sutra and again failed to attain Buddhahood during the lifetime of Shakyamuni Buddha, or whether I faltered and fell away from the teachings that I heard numberless major world system dust particle kalpas ago, and thus have been reborn in this age. While one is practicing the teachings of the Lotus Sutra, one may surmount all kinds of difficulties occasioned by the evil forces of worldly life, or by the persecutions of rulers, non-Buddhists, or the followers of the Hinayana Sutras. And yet one may encounter someone like Tao Cho, Shan Tao, or Honen, priests who seemed thoroughly conversant with the teachings of the provisional and true Mahayana Sutras, but who were in fact possessed by devils. Such men praise the Lotus Sutra most forcefully, but in fact they belittle the people's capacity to understand it, claiming that its principles are very profound, but human understanding is slight. They mislead others by saying that not a single person has ever attained Buddhahood through that sutra, or that not even 1 person in 1,000 can be saved by it. Thus, over a period of countless lifetimes, people are deceived at the top of page 239, second column. People are deceived as often as there are sands in the Ganges until they abandon their faith in the Lotus Sutra and descend to the teachings of the provisional Mahayana Sutras, abandon these and descend to the teachings of the Hinayana Sutras, and eventually abandon even these and descend to the teachings and scriptures of the non-Buddhist doctrines. I understand all too well how, in the end, people have come in this way to fall into the evil paths. I, Nichiren, am the only person in all Japan who understands this. But if I utter so much as a word concerning it, then parents, brothers, and teachers will surely censure me, and the ruler of the nation will take steps against me. On the other hand, I am fully aware that if I do not speak out, I will be lacking in compassion. He's talking about Shakabuku versus Shoju here. Right. I am fully aware that if I do not speak out, I will be lacking in compassion. I have considered which course to take in the light of the teachings of the Lotus and Nirvana Sutras. If I remain silent, I may escape persecutions in this lifetime, but in my next life, I will most certainly fall into the hell of incessant suffering. If I speak out, I am fully aware that I will have to contend with the 3 obstacles and 4 devils. But of these 2 courses, surely the latter is the one to choose. If I were to falter, last full paragraph, page 239, second column. If I were to falter in my determination in the face of persecutions by the sovereign, however, I would be better not to speak out. If I were to falter in my determination in the face of persecutions by the sovereign, however, I would be better not to speak out. While thinking this over, I recalled the teachings of the Treasure Tower chapter on the 6 difficult and 9 easy acts. Persons like myself who are of paltry strength might still be able to lift Mount Sumeru and toss it about. Persons like myself who are lacking in supernatural powers might still shoulder a load of dry grass and yet remain unburned in a fire at the end of the call of decline. And persons like myself who are without wisdom might still read and memorize as many sutras as there are sands in the Ganges. But such acts are not difficult, we are told, top of page 240, when compared to the difficulty of embracing even one phrase or verse of the Lotus Sutra in the latter day of the law. Nevertheless, I vowed to summon up a powerful and unconquerable desire for the salvation of all beings and never to falter in my efforts. It is already over 20 years since I proclaimed my doctrines. Day after day, month after month, year after year, I have been subjected to repeated persecutions. Minor persecutions and annoyances are too numerous to even be counted, but the major persecutions number 4. Among the 4, twice I have been subjected to persecutions by the rulers of the country. The most recent one has come near to costing me my life. In addition, my disciples, my lay supporters, and even those who have merely listened to my teachings have been subjected to severe punishment and treated as though they were guilty of treason. In the 4th volume of the Lotus Sutra, we read, since hatred and jealousy toward the sutra abound even when the thus come one is in the world, how much more will this be so after his passing? The 2nd volume states, if this person should slander a sutra such as this, or on seeing those who read, recite, copy, and uphold this sutra, should despise, hate, envy, or bear grudges against them, me included. And the 5th volume says, the Lotus Sutra, will face much hostility in the world and be difficult to believe. It also states there will be many ignorant people who will curse and speak ill of us, and they will address the rulers, high ministers, Brahmins, and householders, as well as the other monks, slandering and speaking ill of us, saying, these are men of perverted views who preach non-Buddhist doctrines. It is also stated in the same volume, again and again we will be banished. And in the 7th volume, some among the group would take sticks of wood or tiles and stones and beat and pelt them. Then top of page 240, 2nd column. First full paragraph. The Nirvana Sutra records, at that time there were innumerable non-Buddhists who plotted together and went as a group to Ajatashatru, the king of Magadha, and said, at present there is a man of incomparable wickedness, a monk called Gautama. All sorts of evil people hoping to gain profit and alms have flocked to him and become his followers. These people do not practice goodness, but instead use the power of spells and magic to win over men like Miheke Shayapa, Sheri Putra, and Magayayana. Tiantai says, it will be much worse in the future because the principles of the Lotus Sutra are so hard to teach. Miolo says, hatred refers to those who have not yet freed themselves from impediments, and jealousy to those who take no delight in listening to the doctrine. The teachers of the 3 schools of the South and the 7 schools of the North in China, as well as the countless other scholars of China, all regarded Tiantai with resentment and animosity. Thus Tokiitsu said, see here, Chi-Yi, those whose disciple are you? With a tongue less than 3 inches long, you slander the teachings that come from the Buddha's long, broad tongue that can cover even his face. In Tong Chun, we read, question, while the Buddha was in the world, were there many who were resentful and jealous? But while the Buddha was in the world, there were many people who were, question, while the Buddha was in the world, there were many who were resentful and jealous. But in the age after his passing, when someone preaches this Lotus Sutra, why do so many oppose that person? Answer: it is said that good medicine tastes bitter. This sutra, which is like good medicine, dispels attachments to the 5 vehicles and establishes the one ultimate principle. It reproaches those in the ranks of ordinary beings and censures those in the ranks of sagehood, denies provisional Mahayana, and refutes Hinayana. It speaks of the heavenly devils as poisonous insects and calls non-Buddhist demons. It censures those who cling to Hinayana teachings, calling them mean and impoverished, and it dismisses bodhisattvas as beginners in learning. For this reason, heavenly devils hate to listen to it. Non-Buddhists find their ears offended. Persons of the 2 vehicles are dumbfounded, and bodhisattvas flee in terror. That is why all these types of people try to make hindrances for the practitioner of the Lotus Sutra. The Buddha was not speaking nonsense when he declared that hatred and jealousy would abound. A clarification of the precept states, the superintendents of priests in the capital of Nara say in their memorial to the throne, just as in the land west of China there was a Brahmin named Demon Eloquence, so now in this eastern realm of Japan there is a shave-pated monk who spits out crafty words. Evil spirits invisibly invite such people to deceive and mislead the world. I, Dingyo, they're not talking about Nichiren, they're talking about Dingyo. So when he says there's a shape, so now in this eastern realm of Japan, there is a shave-pated monk who spits out crafty words. Evil spirits invisibly invite such people to deceive and mislead the world. This quote is talking about Dingyo. I, Dingyo, replied that these charges by saying, just as in the Qi dynasty of China, we heard of the arrogant superintendent of priests, Hui Guang, so now in our own country, we see these 6 superintendents of priests. How true was the Buddhist prediction in the Lotus Sutra that the situation would be much worse after his passing? The outstanding principle of the Lotus Sutra states, which I think is Nagarjuna, speaking of the age, the propagation of the true teaching will begin in the age when the middle day of the law ends and the latter day opens. Regarding the land, it will begin in the land to the east of Tang and to the west of Katsu. As for the people, it will be spread among people stained by the 5 impurities who live in a time of conflict. The sutra says, since hatred and jealousy toward this sutra abound even when the thus come one is in the world, how much more so will this be after his passing? There is good reason for this statement. When a little boy is given moxibustion treatment, top of page 241, second column, he will invariably resent his mother. When a seriously ill person is given good medicine, he will complain without fail about its bitterness. And we meet with similar complaints about the Lotus Sutra, even in the lifetime of the Buddha. How much more severe is the opposition after his passing? Especially in the middle and latter days of the law, and in a far-off country like Japan, as mountains pile upon mountains and waves follow waves, so do persecutions add to persecutions and criticisms augment criticisms. During the middle day of the law, one man alone, Tantai, understood and expounded the Lotus Sutra and the other sutras. The other Buddhist leaders of both the other Buddhist leaders of both northern and southern China hated him for it. But the 2 sage rulers of the Chen and Sui dynasties gave him an audience so he could establish the correctness of his views in debate with his opponents. Thus, in time, he ceased to have any more opponents. At the end of the middle day of the law, one man alone, Dingyo, grasped the Lotus Sutra and the other sutras just as the Buddha had expounded them. The seven major temples of Nara rose up like hornets against him, but the 2 worthy sovereigns, Emperor Kamu and Emperor Sage, themselves investigating the views of both sides, made clear which was correct, and thereafter there was no further trouble. It is now over 200 years since the latter day of the law began. The Buddha, this is Daishonin quoting again. It is now over 200 years, the bottom of page 241, second column. It is now over 200 years since the latter day of the law began. The Buddha predicted the conditions would be much worse after his passing, and we see that the portents of this in the quarreling and wranglings that go on today because unreasonable doctrines are prevalent. And as proof of the fact that we are living in a muddied age, I was not summoned for a doctrinal debate with my opponents, but instead I was sent into exile and my very life imperiled. When it comes to understanding the Lotus Sutra, top of page 242, first column, when it comes to understanding the Lotus Sutra, I have only a minute fraction of the vast ability that Tentai and Dingyo possessed. But as regards my ability to endure persecution and the wealth of my compassion for others, I believe they would hold me in awe. As a votary of the Lotus Sutra, I firmly believe that I should come under the protection of the gods, and yet I do not see the slightest sign of this. On the contrary, I am subjected to increasingly severe punishments. In view of this, am I perhaps then not a votary of the Lotus Sutra after all? Or have the heavenly gods and benevolent deities perhaps taken leave and departed from this land of Japan? I find myself in much perplexity. But then I recall the 20 lines of verse in the encouraging devotion chapter of the 5th volume of Lotus Sutra. He says, if I, Nichiren, had not been born in this land of Japan, then the words of the world-honored one predicting such persecutions would have been a great prevarication. And those 800,000 million Nayutas of bodhisattvas would have been guilty of the same offense as that of Devadatta of lying and misleading others. The sutra says, there will be many ignorant people who will curse and speak ill of us and will attack us with swords and staves, with rocks and tiles. Look around you in the world today. Are there any priests other than Nichiren who are cursed and vilified because of the Lotus Sutra, or who are attacked with swords and staves? If it were not for Nichiren, the prophecy made in this verse of the sutra would have been sheer falsehood. The same passage says, in that evil age there will be monks with perverse wisdom and hearts that are fawning and crooked, and they will preach the law to white-robed laymen and will be respected and revered by the world as though they were arhats who possess the 6 transcendental powers. If it were not for the priests of the Nimbutsu, Zen, and precept schools of our present age, then the world-honored one would have been a teller of great untruths. The passage likewise says, because in the midst of the great assembly they will address the rulers, high ministers, Brahmins, and householders, slandering and speaking ill of us. If the priests of today did not slander me to the authorities and have them condemn me to banishment, then this passage in the sutra would have remained unfulfilled. Again and again we will be banished, said the sutra. But if Nichiren had not been banished time and again for the sake of the Lotus Sutra, what would these words again and again have meant? Even Tentai and Dingyo were not able to fulfill these predictions represented by the words again and again, much less was anyone else. But because I have been born at the beginning of the latter day of the law, the age of fear and evil, described in the sutra, I alone have been able to live these words. As other examples of prophecies that were fulfilled in the Buddha's successor sutra, it is recorded that the world-honored one said that 100 years after his passing, a ruler named Ashoka the Great would appear. In the Maya Sutra, he says that 600 years after his passing, a man named Bodhisattva Nagarjuna would appear in southern India. And in the Great Compassion Sutra, he said that 60 years after his passing, a man named Madhyakita would establish his base in the Dragon Palace. All these prophecies came true. Indeed, if they had not, who would believe in the Buddha's teachings? Top of page 243. Thus, the Buddha described the time when the votary of the Lotus Sutra should appear, describing it as an age of fear and evil, the latter age hereafter. The latter age hereafter when the law is about to perish, and the last 500-year period, as attested by the 2 Chinese versions of the Lotus Sutra of the Correct Law and the Lotus Sutra of the Wonderful Law. At such a time, if the 3 powerful enemies predicted, and Kumarajiva is the one that translated the Lotus Sutra of the Wonderful Law, and that's the one that we normally go by, but he does occasionally say, hey, the translation that's called the Lotus Sutra of the Correct Law, he quotes it. He doesn't ever use it. At such a time, if the 3 powerful enemies, they're both translations, same word. At such a time, if the three powerful enemies predicted in the Lotus Sutra did not appear, then who would believe in the words of the Buddha? If it were not for Nichiren, who could fulfill the Buddha's prophecies concerning the votary of the Lotus Sutra? The 3 schools of southern China and the 7 schools of northern China, along with the 7 major temples of Nara, were numbered among the enemies of the Lotus Sutra in the time of the middle day of the law. How much less can the Zen precepts and Nembutsu priests of the present time hope to escape a similar label? With this body of mine, I have fulfilled the prophecies of the sutra. The more the government authorities rage against me, the greater is my joy. For instance, there are certain Hinayana bodhisattvas not yet freed from delusion who draw evil karma to themselves by their own compassionate vow. If they see that their father and mother have fallen into hell and are suffering greatly, they will deliberately create the appropriate karma. This is where Ganken Ogo comes from, in hopes that they may too fall into hell and share in and take their suffering upon themselves. Thus, suffering is a joy to them. Don't get it? I'll explain it. It is the same with me. In fulfilling the prophecies, though at present I must face trials that I can scarcely endure, I rejoice when I think that in the future I will escape being born into the evil past. Okay, let me just reread this paragraph and slow it down. Okay, it says, let me go into the 3 schools of this, let me go here. All right, what he's explaining is that he's living in the time that's described by the sutra, okay? And that because he's living literally the sutra, by virtue of the persecutions that he's having to deal with, they don't bother him. They are not persecutions to him. He's explaining that the way I embrace these persecutions is with great joy, because it means I'm all that in a bag of chips. I've been being spoken of repeatedly in this sutra. I have now made my advent. That's why I have confidence in what I'm saying and what I'm asking you to believe. Let me reread that middle. Okay. With this body of mine. So what is he saying by that sentence? With this body of mine. He's saying, me as the human being, Nichiren, with this body of mine, with this body of mine, I have fulfilled the prophecies of this sutra. I'm the only one that's been persecuted like this.
Yes.
Even Tentai and Dingyo didn't have to go through this shit. That's what he just said.
Right.
The more the government authorities rage against me, the greater is my joy, because the more it proves to me that I am the Buddha of the latter day of the law.
Yes.
Okay? And that my Nam-myoho Renge-kyo is the real deal. It's really what they were talking about that would appear in the 5th 500-year period. For instance, there are certain Hinayana bodhisattvas not yet freed from delusion,
Yes.
who out of mercy to their parents and those that they care for, because they understand the supremacy of their life while the others do not.
Right. Got it.
Okay? Who draw evil karma to themselves because they can blow it off. They can show how to blow it off.
Yes.
Who draw evil karma to themselves by their own compassionate vow. That's what Bodhisattva Virith is.
Yes.
If they see that their father and mother have fallen into hell, or any of the people that they care about, and are suffering greatly, they will deliberately create the appropriate karma to be born back into their environment to save them. They will deliberately create the appropriate karma in hopes that they too may fall into hell and share in and take their sufferings, thus the others' sufferings, upon themselves. The suffering is a joy to them. It is the same with me in fulfilling the prophecies. Though at present I must face trials that I can scarcely endure, I rejoice when I think that in the future I will escape being born into the evil past. And yet the people doubt me, and I too have doubts about myself, the Daishonin is saying on page 243 at the bottom of the first column. And I too have doubts about myself. Why do the gods not assist me? Heavenly gods and other guardian deities made their vow before the Buddha. Even if the votary of the Lotus Sutra were an ape rather than a man, they should address him as a votary of the Lotus Sutra and rush forward to fulfill the vow they made before the Buddha to protect him. Does their failure to do so mean that I am in fact not a votary of the Lotus Sutra? This doubt lies at the heart of this piece I am writing, and because it is the most important concern of my entire life, I will raise it again and again here and emphasize it more than ever before I attempt to answer it. The prince, so now he's saying, now I'm going to go into all the stuff that makes this make sense to me. I hope you can dig it. Prince Chicha, in his heart, had promised to give the Lord of Sui, the precious royal sword that he wore. Therefore, when he later found that the Lord Su had died, he placed the sword on his grave. Wang Shao, having drunk water from a river, carefully tossed a gold coin into the water as payment. Hung Yin, finding that his lord had been killed, cut open his stomach, inserted his lord's liver in it before he died. These were worthy men who knew how to repay a debt of gratitude. How much more so then should this be with the case of with great men like with great sages like Shariputra or Mahekeshayapa, who observed every one of the 250 precepts and the 3,000 rules of conduct and had cut themselves off from the illusions of thought and desire and separated themselves from the threefold world. They are worthy to be leaders of Brahma, Chakra, and the other heavenly gods and the eyes of all living beings. During the first 40 and more years of the Buddha's preaching, these men were disliked and pushed aside with admonitions that they could never attain Buddhahood. But when they had tasted the medicine of immortality in the Lotus Sutra, they were like scorched. But when they had tasted the medicine of immortality in the Lotus Sutra, the prediction that they would attain Buddhahood by Shakyamuni and that they would become the Buddha, glow, blow, whatever. During the first 40 and more years of the Buddha's preachings, these men were disliked and pushed aside with admonitions that they could never attain Buddhahood. But when they had tasted the medicine of immortality in the Lotus Sutra, when they had been predicted to become Buddhas, they were like scorched seeds that sprout. A shattered rock joined together again, or a withered tree that puts forth blossoms and fruit. Remember when he was saying before, the quote was, why couldn't the people of the two vehicles ever attain Buddhahood? How could a withered tree ever put forth a blossom? How could a smashed rock ever put itself back together? He says, it's as though all of this were happening. All of those things that were impossible, he now is using as it, by virtue of the teaching of the Lotus Sutra, it's as though all of that can happen. That's all been reversed by the Lotus Sutra alone. All right? Through the Lotus Sutra, when he talks about it, it was as though, but when they had tasted the medicine of immortality in the Lotus Sutra, they were like the scorched seeds that sprout, that impossible thing being reversed. They were like a shattered rock joined together again, that impossible thing being reversed, or like a withered tree putting forth blossoms and fruit, like that thing that was impossible being reversed. Through the Lotus Sutra, it was revealed that they would attain Buddhahood after all, though they had yet to enter the 8 phases of a Buddha's existence. How then can they not do something to repay the profound gratitude that they owe to the sutra? If they do not do so, they will show themselves to be inferior to the worthy men I mentioned earlier, and in fact be no more than animals who have no misunderstanding of a debt of gratitude. The turtle that Ma Po saved did not forget to repay the kindness of the past. The great fish of Kuming Pond, in order to repay the man who had saved his life, presented a bright jewel in the middle of the night. Even these creatures understood how to repay a debt of gratitude. So why shouldn't men who are great sages? He's saying, why shouldn't they be protecting me now? That's what he's really referring to. The Venerable Ananda was the second son of King Drodadana, and the Venerable Rahula was the grandson of King Shuddhadana. Both men were born into very distinguished families and even attained arhatship. However, they were declared to be unable to attain Buddhahood. And yet, during the 8-year assembly at Eagle Peak, when the Lotus Sutra was preached, it was revealed that they would become Buddhas with such a name as Thus Come One, Mountain Sea Wisdom, Unrestricted Power King, and the Thus Come One stepping on 7 treasures flowers. No matter how distinguished, pardon me? No matter how distinguished their families or what great sages they were, if it had not been for the revelation of the Lotus Sutra, who would have paid them respect? King Xie of the Hui dynasty and King Chao of the Yin dynasty were lords of an army of 10,000 chariots and commanded the allegiance of the entire populace of their kingdoms. But because they governed despotically and brought about the downfall of their dynasties, people speak of Xie and Chao as the epitome of evil men. Even a person of low station or a leper, if he is likened to Xie or Chao, will be enraged at the insult. If it had not been for the Lotus Sutra, then who would ever have heard of the 1,200 voice hearers and the countless other voice hearers who would attain Buddhahood through the sutra and who would have listened to their voices? No one would have read the Buddhist sutras compiled by the 1,000 voice hearers, nor would there be any paintings or wooden statues of them set up and worshipped. It is entirely due to the power of the Lotus Sutra that these arhats are revered and followed. Pardon me. If these voice hearers were to separate themselves from the Lotus Sutra, they would be like fish without water, a monkey without a tree, a baby without a breast, or a people without a sovereign. How then can they abandon the votary of the Lotus Sutra? He's saying again, where am I not getting the protection? Through the sutras that precede the Lotus Sutra, the voice hearers have acquired the heavenly eye and the wisdom eye in addition to their physical eyes. Through the Lotus Sutra, they have been provided with the Dharma eye and the Buddha eye. Those are the 5 eyes. Their eyesight can penetrate any of the worlds in the 10 directions. How then could they fail to see me, the votary of the Lotus Sutra, right here in the Sahe world? Even if I were an evil man who had said a word or two against them, or even if I cursed and reviled the voice hearers for a year or two, a kalpa or 2, or 1,000 or 100, 1,000, 10,000, or 1,000,000 kalpas, and went so far as to threaten to take up swords and staves against them. So long as I maintain my faith in the Lotus Sutra and act as its votary, they should never abandon me. As a child may curse his parents, but would the parents for that reason cast him aside? The young owls eat their mother, but the mother nevertheless does not abandon them. The Hake beast kills its father, but the father does nothing to prevent this. If even animals behave like this, then why should great sages abandon the votary of the Lotus Sutra? The 4 great voice hearers in the passage that expresses their understanding proclaim, "Now we have become voice hearers in truth, for we will take the voice of the Buddha way and cause it to be heard by all. Now we have become true arhats, for everywhere among the human and heavenly beings, devils and Brahmas of the various worlds, we deserve to receive offerings. The world-honored one in his great mercy makes use of a rare thing in pity and compassion, teaching and converting, bringing benefit to us. In numberless millions of kalpas, who could ever repay him? Though we offer him our hands and feet, bow our heads in respectful obeisance, and present all manner of offerings, none of us could repay him. Though we lift him on the crown of our heads, bear him on our 2 shoulders, for kalpas numerous as Ganges sends, reverence him with all our hearts. Though we come with delicate foods, with countless jeweled robes, with articles of bedding, various kinds of potions and medicines, with ox head, sandalwood, and all kinds of rare gems, construct memorial towers and spread the ground with jeweled robes. Though we would do all this by way of offering for kalpas numerous as Ganges sands, still we could not repay him." In the various sutras preached during the earlier period of the Buddha's teaching life, which have been compared to the first of the 4 flavors, the voice hearers were depicted on countless occasions as being subjected to all kinds of abuse and shamed before the great assembly of human and heavenly beings. Thus, we are told that the sound of the venerable Mahekashayapas weeping and wailing echoed throughout the major world system, and that the venerable Subhuti was so dumbfounded that he almost went off and left the alms bowl he had been carrying. The Shariputra spat out the food he was eating, and the Purna was berated for being the kind who would put filth in a precious jar. That's all the Buddha said all that about those guys. When the world-honored one was at Deer Park, he extolled the Agama Sutras and enjoined his disciples to rely on the 250 precepts as their teacher, warmly praising those who did so. And yet, before long, as we have seen, he turned about and began condemning such men. You're understanding me, right? Okay. When the world, this middle of page 245, second column, when the world-honored one, when Shakyamuni was at Deer Park at the very beginning, okay, after he'd done the Flower Garland Sutra, he was at Deer Park when he did the Agamas, all right? He extolled the Agama Sutras and enjoined his disciples to rely on the 250 precepts of the Agama Sutras as their teacher, warmly praising those who did so at that time.
Right.
And yet, before long, as we have seen, he turned about and began condemning such men, because that's where Shariputra and all those original disciples, they're all voice hearers, right? Okay, and cause awakened ones. He is guilty, we would have to say, of making two different and completely contradictory pronouncements. Pardon me. Thus, for example, the world-honored one cursed Devadatta, saying, "You were a fool who licks the spit of others." Devadatta felt as though a poison arrow had been shot into his breast, and he cried out in anger, declaring, "Gautama is no Buddha. I am the eldest son of King Drodadana, the elder brother of the venerable Ananda and kin to Gautama. No matter what kind of evil conduct I might be guilty of, he ought to admonish me in private for it. But to publicly and outrageously accuse me of faults in front of this great assembly of human and heavenly beings, is this the behavior appropriate to a great man or a Buddha? He showed himself to be my enemy in the past when he stole the woman I intended to marry, and he has shown himself my enemy at this gathering today. From this day forward, I will look upon him as my archenemy for a lifetime after a lifetime and age after age to come." When we stop to consider, we note that of the great voice hearers, some were originally from non-Buddhist Brahmin families and were leaders of various non-Buddhist orders who had converted kings to their teachings and were looked up to by their followers. Others were men of noble families or the possessors of great wealth. But they abandoned their exalted positions in life, lowered the banners of their pride, cast off everyday clothing, and wrapped their bodies in humble, dingy-hued robes of a Buddhist monk. They threw away their white fly whisk, which was the Brahmin thing, right? Brahmin thing. They threw away their white fly whisks, their bows and arrows, and took up a solitary alms bowl, becoming like paupers and beggars and following the world-honored one. They had no dwellings to protect them from the wind and rain, and very little in the way of food or clothing by which to sustain life. Moreover, all the people of the 5 regions and the 4 seas of India were disciples or lay supporters of the non-Buddhist teachers, so that even the Buddha himself was on 9 occasions forced to suffer major hardships. Thus, for example, Devadatta hurled a great stone at him, and King Ajatashatru loosed a drunken elephant on him. Failing to receive alms from King Aginadatta, the Buddha was forced to eat horse fodder, and at a Brahmin city he was offered stinking rice gruel. Again, Kincha, the daughter of a Brahmin, tying a bowl to her belly, claimed to be pregnant with his child. Needless to say, the Buddha's disciples were likewise forced to suffer frequent hardships. Thus, countless numbers of the Shakya clan were killed by King Viradaka, and tens of millions of Buddhist followers were trampled to death by drunken elephants that were set upon them. The nun Utpalavarna was killed by Devadatta, and the venerable Koladayan was buried in horse dung, and the venerable Madhyayana was beaten to death by members of the Brahmin group called Bamboo Staff. In addition, followers of the 6 non-Buddhist teachers banded together and slandered the Buddha before King Ajatashatru and King Prasenajit, saying, Gautama is the most evil man in the whole land of Jampadvipa. Wherever he may be, the 3 calamities and 7 disasters rampage without fail. As the numerous rivers gather together in the great sea and the groves of trees cluster on the great mountains, so crowds of evil men gather about Gautama. The men called Mahekeshayapa, Shariputra, Madhyayana, and Subhuti are examples. All those who are born in human form should place loyalty to the sovereign and filial piety above all else. But these men have been so misled by Gautama that they disregard the lessons of their parents, abandon their families, and defying the commandments of the king, go to live in the mountain forests. They should be expelled from this country. It is because they are allowed to remain that the sun, moon, and stars manifest sinister phenomena and many strange happenings occur in the land. The voice hearers did not know how they could possibly bear such persecution. Again, Mahekashayapa, Shariputra, Madhyayana, Subhuti, these are all voice hearers. The voice hearers could not know how to possibly bear such persecutions. Then, as if to add to their hardship, the Buddha himself began to denounce them. They found it difficult to follow him. Now and then, hearing him condemn them repeatedly in great assemblies of human and heavenly beings and not knowing how to behave, they only became more confused. On top of all this, they had to face the greatest hardship of all, as revealed in the Vimalakirti Sutra, when the Buddha addressed the voice here, saying, Those who give alms to you are cultivating themselves no field of good fortune. Those who give alms to you will fall into the 3 evil paths. Whoa! These words were spoken when the Buddha was staying at Ambapali Garden. There, Brahma, Shakra, and the deities of the sun and the moon, the 4 heavenly kings and the heavenly gods of the threefold world, along with earthly gods, top of page 247, dragon gods, and other beings as numerous as the sands of the Ganges had gathered in this great assembly, when the Buddha said, The heaven and humanly beings who give alms to Subhuti and the other monks will fall into the 3 evil paths. After the heavenly and human beings had heard this, they would be likely to go on giving alms to the voice hearers? After the heavenly and human beings had heard this, would they be likely to go on giving alms to the voice hearers? It would almost appear as though the Buddha were deliberately attempting through his words to inflict death upon those who uphold the 2 vehicles. The more sensible persons in the assembly were no doubt repelled by the Buddha's actions. Nevertheless, the voice hearers were able to obtain enough of the alms given to the Buddha to keep themselves alive, meager though the amount was. When I consider the situation, it occurs to me that if the Buddha had passed away after preaching the various sutras delivered in the first 40 and more years of his teaching life, and had not lived to preach the Lotus Sutra in the following 8 years, then who would have offered alms to these venerable ones? They would have been living in the realm of hungry spirits. But after more than 40 years of preaching various sutra, it was as though the bright spring sun emerged to melt the frigid ice, or a great wind arose to dispel the dew from countless grasses. With one remark, in one moment, the Buddha wiped away his earlier pronouncement, saying, I have not yet revealed the truth. Like a great wind scattering the dark clouds, or the full moon in the vast heavens, or like the sun shining in the blue sky, he proclaimed, The world-honored one has long expounded his doctrines and now must reveal the truth. With the brilliance of the sun or the brightness of the moon, it was revealed in the Lotus Sutra that Shariputra would become the thus come one flower glow, and that Mahekeshayapa would become the thus come one light bright. Because of the Lotus Sutra, the phoenix among scriptures, and the mirror that reflects the teachings after the Buddha's passing, the voice hearers were looked up to by the human and heavenly supporters of Buddhism, just as the Buddha would be. If the water is clear, then the moon will not fail to be reflected there. If the wind blows, then the grass and the trees will not fail to bow before it. And if there is a votary of the Lotus Sutra, then the sages, the voice hearers, should not fail to go to his side, though they might have to pass through a great fire or make their way through a great rock to do so. Though Maheke Shayapa may be deep in meditation, he should not ignore the circumstances. Why does he do nothing about the situation? I am completely perplexed. He's talking about why am I not being protected? This is still the question that he's posing for the sake of his disciples to understand why it is the way it is. He's not questioning it, but he's posing it as a question as though you must be thinking. Why does he not do something about the situation? I am completely perplexed. Is this not the last 500-year period? Is the prediction that the Lotus Sutra will spread abroad widely merely nonsense? Is Nichiren not the votary of the Lotus Sutra? Are the voice hearers protecting those who disparage the Lotus Sutra as a mere written teaching and put forth their great lies about what they call a special transmission? He's talking about Zen there. Are they guarding those who write? Are they guarding those who discard, close, ignore, abandon, urging people to close the gate to the teachings of the Lotus Sutra and to throw away its scrolls and who cause the ruin of the temples dedicated to the practice of the Lotus Sutra? There he's talking about Honen or one of those dudes. The various heavenly deities swore before the Buddha to protect the votary of the Lotus Sutra. But now they see how fierce are the great persecutions of this muddied age. Pardon me. Let me go. The various heavenly deities swore before the Buddha to protect the votary of the Lotus Sutra. But now that they see how fierce are the great persecutions of this muddied age, do they fail to come down? But now, pardon me. Let me say it again. I'm trying to get the right intonation. The various heavenly deities swore before the Buddha to protect the votary of Lotus Sutra, but now that they see how fierce are the great persecutions of this muddied age, how do they fail to come down? The sun and the moon are still up in the sky. Mount Sumeru has not collapsed. The ocean tides ebb and flow. The four seasons proceed in their normal order. Why then is there no sign of aid for the votary of the Lotus Sutra? My doubts grow deeper than ever, it says at the top of page 248. In the sutras preached before the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha is shown predicting that various great bodhisattvas and heavenly human beings will attain Buddhahood in the future. But trying to realize such predictions is like trying to grasp the moon in the water, like mistaking the reflection for the actual object. It has the color and shape of the object, but not the reality. Likewise, the Buddha would seem to be displaying profound kindness in making such predictions, but in fact it is little kindness at all. When the world-honored one had first attained enlightenment, it had not yet begun to preach. More than 60 great bodhisattvas, including Dharma Wisdom, Forest of Merits, Diamond Banner, and Diamond Storehouse, appeared from the various Buddha lands of the 10 directions and came before Shakyamuni Buddha, the Lord of Teachings. There, at the request of the Bodhisattva Chief-Wise, Moon of Deliverance, and others, they preached the doctrines of the 10 stages of security, the 10 stages of practice, the 10 stages of devotion, the 10 stages of development, and so forth. The doctrines that these great bodhisattvas preached were not learned from Shakyamuni Buddha. At that time, Brahma and other deities of the worlds of the 10 directions came together and preached the various teachings. But again, those were not what they had learned from Shakyamuni. These great bodhisattvas, deities, dragons, and others who appeared at the assembly described in the Flower Garland Sutra were beings who had dwelt in inconceivable emancipation since before Shakyamuni Buddha began preaching. Perhaps they were disciples of Shakyamuni when he was carrying out bodhisattva practices in previous existences, or perhaps they were disciples of previous Buddhas of the worlds of the 10 directions at the top of page 248, second column. In any event, they were not disciples of the Shakyamuni who first attained enlightenment in this world and expounded his lifetime teachings. It was only when the Buddha set forth in the 4 teachings of the Agama, correct and equal, and wisdom periods that he finally acquired disciples. And although they were doctrines preached by the Buddha himself, They were not doctrines that revealed his true intention. Why do I say this? Because the specific and perfect teachings as set forth in the sutras of the correct and equal and wisdom periods do not differ in meaning from the specific and perfect teachings as set forth in the Flower Garland Sutra. The specific and perfect teachings given in the Flower Garland Sutra are not the specific and perfect teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha. Okay. They are the specific and perfect teachings of Dharma wisdom, who preached that. Okay? And the other great bodhisattvas mentioned earlier. These great bodhisattvas may appear to most people to have been disciples of Shakyamuni Buddha, but in fact it would have been better to call them his teachers. The world-honored one listened to these bodhisattvas preaching and, after gaining wisdom and understanding, proceeded to set forth the specific and perfect teachings of the sutras of the correct and equal and the wisdom periods. But these differ in no way from the specific and perfect teachings of the Flower Garland Sutra. Therefore, we know that these great bodhisattvas were the teachers of Shakyamuni. These bodhisattvas are mentioned in the Flower Garland Sutra, where they are called good friends. To call a person a good friend means that that person is neither one's teacher nor one's disciple. The two types of teachings called Tripitaka and connecting teaching are offshoots of the specific and perfect teachings. Anyone who understands the specific and perfect teachings will invariably understand the Tripitaka and the connecting teachings as well. Top of page 249. A teacher is someone who teaches his disciple things that they did not previously know. For example, in the age before the Buddha, the heavenly and human beings and followers of Brahmanism were all disciples of the two deities and the three aesthetics. Though their doctrines branched off to form 95 different schools, these did not go beyond the views of the three aesthetics. Shakyamuni, the Lord of Teachings, also studied these doctrines and for a time became a disciple of the Brahmanic teachers. But after spending 12 years in various painful and uncomfortable practices, he came to understand the principles of suffering, emptiness, impermanence, and non-self. Therefore, he ceased to call himself a disciple of the Brahmanic teachings and instead proclaimed himself the possessor of a wisdom acquired from no teacher at all. Thus, in time, the human and heavenly beings came to look up to him as a great teacher. It is clear, therefore, that during the teaching period of the first four flavors, Shakyamuni, the Lord of Teachers, was a disciple of Dharma wisdom, and that the other great bodhisattvas. It is clear, middle of page 249. It is clear, it's the second full paragraph. It is clear, therefore, that during the teaching period of the first four flavors, Shakyamuni, the Lord of Teachings, was a disciple of Dharma wisdom, and that the other great bodhisattvas. Similarly, he was the ninth disciple of Bodhisattva Manjushri. This is also the reason why the Buddha repeatedly declares in the earlier sutras, "I never preached a single word." When Shakyamuni Buddha was 72, he preached the Immeasurable Meaning Sutra on Eagle Peak in the kingdom of Magadha. At that time, he denied all the sutras he had preached during the previous more than 40 years and all the fragmentary teachings derived from those sutras, saying, "In these more than 40 years, I have not yet revealed the truth." At that time, the great bodhisattvas and the various heavenly and human beings hastened to implore the Buddha to reveal the true doctrine. Top of page 249, second column. In fact, in the Immeasurable Meaning Sutra, he made a single pronouncement that appeared to suggest the true doctrine, but he did not elaborate on it. It was like the moment when the moon is about to rise. The moon is still hidden behind the eastern hills, and though its glow begins to light the western hills, people cannot yet see the body of the moon itself. In the Expedient Means chapter of the Lotus Sutra, in the section that concisely reveals the replacement of the three vehicles with the one vehicle, the Buddha briefly explained the concept of 3,000 realms in a single moment of life, the doctrine that he had kept in mind for his final revelation. But because this was the first time he had touched on the subject, it was only dimly apprehended, like the first note of a cuckoo heard by someone drowsy with sleep, or like the moon appearing over the rim of the hill, but veiled in thin clouds. Shariputra and the others, startled, called the heavenly beings, dragon deities, and great bodhisattvas together, and, begging for instruction, said, the heavenly beings, dragon spirits, and the others, their numbers like Ganges sands, the bodhisattvas seeking to be the Buddhas in a great force of 80,000, as well as the wheel-turning kings who come from 10,000s of millions of lands, all press their palms and with reverent minds wish to hear the teaching of perfect endowment. The passage indicates that they requested to hear a doctrine such as they had not heard in the previous more than 40 years, one that differed from the four flavors in the three teachings. With regard to the part they wished to hear the teaching of perfect endowment, it may be noted that the Nirvana Sutra states, Sat, S-A-D, indicates perfect endowment. The profound meaning of the four Mahayana treaties states, Sad connotes 6. In India, the number 6 implies perfect endowment. In his commentary, Chi Tsang writes, Sad is translated as perfect endowment. In the 8th volume of his Profound Meanings of the Lotus Sutra, Tentai remarks, Sad is a Sanskrit word which is translated as myo, or wonderful. Bodhisattva Nagarjuna, in the heart of his 1,000-volume treatise on the great perfection of wisdom, comments, Sad signifies 6. Nagarjuna was the 13th in the lineage of the Buddha's successors, the founder of the True Word, Flower Garland, and other schools, a great sage of the first stage of development, and the person whose true identity was the thus come one Dharma Cloud's Freedom King. The characters Myoho Rengekyo are Chinese. In India, the Lotus Sutra is called Saddharma Pundarika Sutra. The following is the mantra concerning the Heart of the Lotus Sutra, composed by the Tripitaka master Shamwu Wei. And I won't, this is all in some language that I won't. Here's the translation. Hail to all the Buddhas, three-bodied thus come ones. Open the door to, show me, cause me to awaken to, and enter into the wisdom and insight of all the Buddhas. You who are like space, who have freed yourself from form. O Sutra of the White Lotus of the correct law, cause me to enter into it, to be everywhere within, to dwell in, and to rejoice in you. O adamantine protector, O empty aspect-free and desire-free Sutra. This mantra, which expresses the heart of the Lotus Sutra, was found in the Iron Tower in southern India. In this mantra, Sadharma means correct and correct law. Sad means correct. Correct is the same as myo, wonderful. Myo is the same as correct. Hence the Lotus Sutra of the correct law and the Lotus Sutra of the wonderful law. And when the two characters for Namu are prefixed to the Myoho Rengekyo or the Lotus Sutra of the wonderful law, we have the formula Nam Myoho Rengekyo. Myo means perfect. Myo means perfect endowment. 6 refers to the 6 paramitas representing the 10,000 practices. When people ask to hear the teaching of perfect endowment, they are asking how they may gain the perfect endowment of the 6 paramitas, the 10,000 practices of the bodhisattvas. In the phrase perfect endowment, endowment refers to the mutual possession of the 10 worlds, which is how we become Buddhas. While perfect means that since there is mutual possession of the 10 worlds, then any one world contains all the other worlds, indicating that this is perfect. The Lotus Sutra is a single work consisting of 8 volumes, 28 chapters, and 69,384 characters. Each and every character is endowed with the character Myo, each being a Buddha who has the 32 features and 80 characteristics. Each of the 10 worlds manifests its own Buddhahood. As Myolo writes, since even Buddhahood is present in all living beings, then all other worlds are, of course, present too. The Buddha replied to the request of his listeners by saying that the Buddha's wish to open the door of the Buddha wisdom to all living beings. The term all living beings here refers to Shariputra, and it also refers to Ikchantikas, persons of incorrigible disbelief. It also refers to the 9 worlds. Thus the Buddha fulfilled his words, living beings are numberless, I vow to save them all, when he declares, at the start I took a vow, hoping to make all persons equal to me without distinction between us, and what I longed for long ago has now been fulfilled. He's basically saying that this perfect teaching is for everyone, not for good people. All the great bodhisattvas, heavenly beings, and others When they had heard the doctrine of the Buddha and comprehended it, said, since times past, we have heard the world-honored one's preaching, but we have never heard this kind of profound, wonderful, and superior law. The great teacher Dingyo comments, in times past, often we have heard of the world-honored one's preaching, refers to the fact that they had heard him preach the great doctrines of the Flower Garland and other sutras in the times previous to the preaching of the Lotus Sutra. We have never heard this kind of profound, wonderful, and superior law means that they had never heard the teaching of the one vehicle of Buddhahood propounded only in the Lotus Sutra. It propounded in the Lotus Sutra, only in the Lotus Sutra. They understood that is that none of the previous Mahayana sutras, none, which are as numerous as the sands of the Ganges and include those of the Flower Garland, correct and equal in wisdom periods, such as the Profound Secrets and Mahavajrana Sutras, had ever made clear the great principle of 3,000 realms in a single moment of life, the core of the Buddha's lifetime teachings, nor had they clarified the bone and marrow of those teachings, the doctrines that persons of the two vehicles can attain Buddhahood, and the Buddha's attainment, and that the Buddha attained enlightenment in the remote past. That's the end of part 1 of the opening of the eyes. We'll continue with part 2 on page 251.